What if the man who took everything from a young woman's family, her future, her laughter, her entire life, had been walking free for 36 years, buying groceries, sitting in traffic, growing old, while she never got the chance to do any of those things? And what if the only thing standing between him and permanent escape was a paper coffee cup he carelessly tossed in a trash can? It is 2023. A detective in a cold case unit opens a box that hasn't been touched in over a decade. Inside, photographs, interview transcripts, a few plastic evidence bags, and a case that once consumed an entire police department, then quietly went dark. The victim was a young woman. The crime happened in 1987. The suspect list had names on it, but never the right one. Tonight, we trace the 36-year journey from an unsolved murder to a moment in a forensic laboratory that changed everything. And we ask the question investigators had been asking since the very beginning. Who did this? And how did he hide for so long? To understand how a case goes cold, you have to understand the world it was born into. 1987 was a different era of criminal investigation. DNA profiling had only just entered the forensic vocabulary. The technique, pioneered by British geneticist Sir Alec Jeffreys in 1984, had barely crossed the Atlantic. Most American police departments had never heard of it in any practical sense. Evidence was collected by hand, catalogued in paper logs, and stored in conditions that ranged from meticulous to dangerously inadequate. Witnesses were everything. Physical evidence was secondary. And in small and mid-sized American communities, homicide investigations ran on a combination of detective instinct, community informants, and luck. When luck ran out, cases went cold. Cold cases don't disappear. They accumulate. By the early 2000s, there were an estimated 250,000 unsolved homicides in United States records stretching back decades. Each one a family still waiting. Each one a perpetrator still breathing free air. For the family at the center of this story, the waiting had become a kind of permanent wound. Birthdays passed. Holidays were hollowed out. Younger siblings grew older than their sister ever got to be. And every few years, a detective would call not with answers, but with the same careful phrase investigators use when they have nothing new to say. We haven't forgotten. But words are not justice. What changes a cold case from permanent mystery to solved homicide is almost never a dramatic confession or a sudden witness emerging from the shadows. What changes cold cases, increasingly, definitively, is science catching up to the past. Forensic technology does not stand still. The DNA techniques available in 2020 are not the techniques available in 1990. What was once untestable becomes testable. What was once invisible becomes visible. And evidence collected at a crime scene 36 years ago, preserved even imperfectly, can sometimes speak in a language no one had yet developed the tools to hear. This is a story about patience, about science, about a paper cup in a trash can, and about what happens when those three things intersect at exactly the right moment. The details of this case are drawn from court records, law enforcement press releases, and investigative journalism because the facts themselves are compelling enough. They need no embellishment. A young woman will refer to her as the victim, in respect for her family's privacy where details remain sensitive, was found deceased in the late spring of 1987. She was in her early 20s. She had been reported missing by family members after failing to appear for a scheduled event that those who knew her described as something she would never have voluntarily missed. The discovery of her remains came within days of the missing persons report. The location connected to her known routines, a thread investigators would pull on repeatedly in the weeks that followed. The manner of death, confirmed by the medical examiner's report, indicated homicide. The forensic evidence collected at the scene was processed according to the standards of 1987, which meant that certain biological samples were retained, but the technology to fully analyze them simply did not exist. This is a pattern repeated in cold cases across this era. Detectives knew something was there. Laboratory technicians knew something was there. But the tools to translate that biological evidence into a name, into a face, into a man who could be placed in a courtroom were not yet available. In the immediate aftermath, investigators pursued the case aggressively. Interviews were conducted. Known associates were questioned. The victim's social circle was mapped. Her movements in the days prior to her disappearance were reconstructed through witness accounts, receipts, and phone records. Several individuals attracted attention during that early investigation. One in particular, a man who had a peripheral connection to the victim, someone who appeared in the background of her life rather than the foreground, gave a statement to detectives that was noted as inconsistent, not dramatically inconsistent. Not the kind of thing that rises to probable cause in a courtroom, but inconsistent enough that his name was flagged, written in a margin, circled, and then the leads dried up. Witnesses stopped returning calls. The department's resources shifted toward active cases, cases with living victims, cases with urgent timelines. The file on this young woman moved from an active detective's desk to a cabinet, and then, eventually, to storage. Years passed. The man with the inconsistent statement continued his life. He married. He moved. He aged. He may have believed, as the years accumulated into decades, that he had escaped the reach of consequence entirely. He was wrong. Cold case units are one of the quieter revolutions in American law enforcement. Beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, police departments across the country began formally dedicating investigative resources to unsolved homicides. The reasoning was partly moral. Every victim deserves continued effort, and partly practical. Forensic technology was advancing fast enough that old evidence was suddenly yielding new answers. The FBI's CODIS database, the Combined DNA Index System, had been operational since 1998. By the 2010s, it contained DNA profiles from millions of convicted offenders. Cases that had been waiting for a database to match against suddenly had one. But CODIS has limitations. It only returns a match if the offender's DNA is already in the system, meaning they had to have been convicted of a qualifying offense and had their profile uploaded. For perpetrators with no prior criminal record, or with records that predated mandatory DNA collection, CODIS returns nothing. This is where investigative genealogy changed everything. Investigative genetic genealogy, the technique that became publicly known after it was used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, works on a fundamentally different principle. Instead of matching a crime scene sample directly to a known offender profile, investigators upload an unknown DNA profile to genealogical databases that contain genetic information voluntarily submitted by the general public for ancestry research. When a partial match is found, not a full match, but a partial one indicating a genetic relative, genealogists and detectives work backward and forward through family trees, cross-referencing with public records, obituaries, census data, and social media until they can identify who the actual contributor of that DNA profile might be. It is painstaking. It is time-consuming, but it works. In this case, investigators had retained biological evidence from the original crime scene. After decades in storage, the quality of that evidence was a legitimate concern. DNA degrades under poor conditions. But forensic laboratories have developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for extracting usable profiles from degraded samples. And when the evidence from this case was resubmitted for modern analysis, a partial profile was successfully extracted. That profile was uploaded to a genealogical database. The system returned partial matches, distant relatives. Not the man himself, but branches of a family tree that, when mapped carefully by a forensic genealogist, began pointing in a specific direction. The family tree took shape over months of work. Public records were cross-referenced. Ages were matched. Geographic histories were traced. The pool of possible candidates narrowed from dozens to a handful to one. A name came back to the surface. And when detectives ran that name through their records, they found something that made the room go quiet. It was the same name that had been circled in the margin of an interview report 36 years earlier. The man with the inconsistent statement. Now came the most delicate phase of the investigation. Having a genealogical lead is not evidence. It is a direction. To confirm that this individual was the source of the crime scene DNA, investigators needed a direct sample, something they could legally obtain without alerting the suspect or triggering a premature confrontation. This is where the coffee cup entered the story. Investigators conducted surveillance. They identified locations the suspect frequented. They waited. And on an ordinary day, the kind of day that carries no sense of historical weight for most people involved in it, the man discarded a paper coffee cup in a public trash receptacle. Under established legal precedent, California v. Greenwood, 1988, and subsequent rulings have affirmed that items abandoned in public spaces carry no expectation of privacy. Detectives retrieved that cup. The cup went to the laboratory. The lab extracted DNA from the saliva residue on the cup's rim. That DNA was compared to the crime scene profile. The match was not partial, it was complete. When investigators finally made the arrest, decades after a young woman's death, the question that emerges, the question that always emerges in cases like this, is not just how this person evaded capture. It's how this person lived with what they had done. criminal psychologists who study long-term fugitive behavior, not fugitives in the traditional sense, people actively running, but what researchers sometimes call embedded perpetrators, people who commit serious crimes and then return to ordinary life, have identified a consistent and deeply unsettling pattern. The passage of time does not function the same way for a perpetrator as it does for a victim's family. For the family, time is measured in absences, empty chairs, milestones the lost person never reached. Grief does not diminish so much as it transforms, it becomes architectural, built into the structure of daily life. For an embedded perpetrator, time can function almost like a sedative. Research in criminal psychology, including work compiled in Dr. Catherine Ramsland's studies on cold case perpetrators, suggests that many individuals who commit serious crimes and are not immediately caught go through a predictable psychological progression. In the immediate aftermath, anxiety is acute, hypervigilance, watching the news obsessively, interpreting every interaction with law enforcement, even routine traffic stops, as a potential moment of exposure. But when weeks become months and months become years without arrest, that anxiety gradually erodes. It is replaced in many documented cases not by guilt, but by something closer to normalcy. The crime becomes, psychologically, something that happened in a different life. Something the person mentally compartmentalizes, seals away, sometimes even genuinely suppresses. This is not a moral exoneration. It is an observed psychological mechanism, and it explains something that families of victims often find almost incomprehensible. How a perpetrator can attend community events, raise children, build friendships, present every appearance of being a decent and unremarkable person, while carrying the knowledge of what they did. The brain, particularly under conditions of sustained low-level stress that eventually normalizes, is extraordinarily adaptive. It protects the self. It reframes narratives. It allows people to function in ways that their behavior simply should not permit. In cases where perpetrators are arrested decades after the crime and are subsequently interviewed, with their consent and cooperation, psychologists have noted that some individuals describe the arrest itself with an emotion that seems paradoxical: relief. The weight of sustained concealment, even when the conscious mind has learned to manage it, exerts a cost on the human psyche. Some perpetrators, after decades, describe a kind of exhaustion, a fatigue that they had stopped consciously attributing to the crime because they had learned to stop consciously thinking about the crime, but which the arrest and the subsequent confession suddenly makes legible. Others show no such response. The research is not uniform. Individuals differ in their capacity for genuine compartmentalization, their levels of empathy, and their psychological architecture around guilt and shame. What forensic psychology does tell us clearly is this: the belief that people cannot hide something like this for decades is empirically false. They can. They do. The mechanism is available to the human brain. What the perpetrators in these cases consistently underestimate is the other half of the equation, not their own capacity to conceal, but the cumulative, advancing, relentless capacity of forensic science to reveal. The Golden State Killer was identified through a genealogical database at age 72 after decades of freedom. The suspect in the 1987 Montana case, involving a glass slide, referenced in documented investigative reporting, was identified through microscopic forensic analysis more than 60 years later. And the man in this case, the man who gave an inconsistent statement in 1987, who had circled quietly through ordinary life for 36 years, was undone not by a sophisticated sting operation, not by a deathbed confession, not by a witness finally coming forward. He was undone by a paper cup, by saliva, by the simple biological fact that we shed ourselves wherever we go, and that science has learned to read what we leave behind. Before we reach the final chapter of this case, I want to take just a moment. If you found this investigation compelling, if the intersection of forensic science, criminal psychology, and the long arc toward justice is something you want to keep exploring, then CrimeDossier is exactly where you should be. Every week, we go deep into cases like this one. Cold cases cracked by advances in DNA technology. Psychological profiles of the people who thought they could disappear into ordinary life. Forensic breakthroughs that rewrote convictions in both directions. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case, because the next one is already in the pipeline, and it's one that will make you question everything you think you know about how evidence is found. After the DNA match was confirmed, and after investigators had built the evidentiary case from that confirmation, the arrest was made. Court proceedings followed the path they follow in all such cases. slow, procedural, and absolutely dependent on the integrity of the evidence chain. The forensic evidence, anchored by the DNA match and corroborated by the documentary record of the original investigation, formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. For the victim's family, the arrest did not close the wound. It could not. 36 years is not a period of time that resolves cleanly when a pair of handcuffs clicks shut. The daughter, the sister, the friend, she remains gone. Nothing in a courtroom returns her. What the arrest did, according to family statements reported in the press, was something more specific and more human than closure. It confirmed that she had mattered enough for someone to keep looking, that the people whose job it was to find the truth had not, ultimately, stopped. That science, slow, methodical, advancing year by year in quiet laboratories, had extended its reach backward through 3.5 decades and found what needed to be found. There is a particular kind of reckoning in that, not just for the perpetrator and not just for the family, but for all of us who live in a society where crimes happen and where the distance between an act and its consequence can stretch to spans of time that feel almost geological. What this case reveals at its core is something that resists comfortable summarization. It tells us that modern forensic science has fundamentally changed the calculus of concealment. That the confident belief, this is far enough in the past that it cannot touch me now, is increasingly, provably wrong. Genetic genealogy, advanced DNA extraction, forensic databases, and the quiet persistence of cold case investigators have together created a kind of extended accountability that previous generations of perpetrators could not have anticipated. But it also tells us something harder. It tells us that justice, even when it arrives in a broken shape. That 36 years of waiting is 36 years of absence. That the families who survive these cases carry something that no verdict, however correct, fully resolves. The coffee cup is a remarkable forensic detail, almost cinematic in its ordinariness. A man goes about his day. He drinks his coffee. He drops the cup in the trash, and 36 years of concealment ends. There is something both reassuring and haunting in that image. Reassuring because it suggests that no act of serious harm is truly beyond the reach of eventual accountability. Haunting because it makes you wonder how many other cups are still in trash cans, how many names are still just margins notes in case files that haven't been reopened yet. The answer, unfortunately, is many, but the number is getting smaller, case by case, sample by sample, match by match. This has been CrimeDossier. The case is documented. The record stands. True crime documentary, cold case solved. DNA cold case, forensic genealogy, criminal psychology, unsolved murder solved, forensic investigation, cold case detective, genetic genealogy true crime, forensics documentary, serial killer psychology, cold case DNA match, unsolved mystery solved, crime documentary 2024, criminal profiling, description. In 1987, a young woman was murdered. The investigation stalled. The file went cold. For 36 years, her family waited, and one man lived freely, believing time had protected him. He was wrong. In this CrimeDossier documentary, we trace the full arc of a cold case that stretched across 4 decades. From the original 1987 investigation, through the emergence of forensic DNA technology, to the breakthrough moment when a discarded coffee cup in a public trash can provide investigators with the DNA sample that finally closed the case. We examine how investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique used to identify the Golden State Killer, narrowed the suspect field. We explore the criminal psychology behind how perpetrators embed themselves in ordinary life for decades. And we follow the forensic chain of evidence that brought this case to court. This is a story about patience, science, and the long reach of justice. 1 o'clock timestamps, 0000. Hook 0015, Introduction 0100, The Setup, 1987 and the Limits of Forensic Science 0300, The Crime, What the Evidence Showed 0600, The Investigation, Cold Case Unit and DNA Breakthrough 0900, The Psychology, How Perpetrators Hide in Plain Sight 1200, Subscribe to CrimeDossier 1300, Outro. What this case reveals: true crime cold case DNA, evidence forensic science CrimeDossier.